Turning now to the war in Ukraine, and Russia claims that Kyiv launched a missile towards Moscow last night. Russian defense officials say the missile was shot down by about 124 miles away from the capital. The attack is one of the biggest known coordinated Ukrainian airstrikes to date on Russian-held territory. Kyiv has not claimed responsibility. Meanwhile, we are learning more about the plane crash that apparently killed Wagner mercenary group boss Yevgeny Prigozhin. In Russia, a U.S. official tells CBS News that the most probable explanation for the crash was an explosion and said that Russian President Vladimir Putin had probably ordered the killing. Prigozhin recently led a failed mutiny against the Kremlin. Well, BBC News correspondent Paul Adams is joining us now with the latest on what's going on in the war. Good to see you. Putin made remarks for the very first time about Prigozhin's death. What did he say?
He did indeed, Anne-Marie. Yes, he called it an aviation tragedy. He offered his condolences to the families of the 10 people on board of that plane. And he did also talk a little bit about Mr. Prigozhin himself. These people, he said, made a significant contribution to the war in Ukraine. But he said that Mr. Prigozhin was a man with a difficult fate, a man who had made serious mistakes. He called him a talented businessman who had made all sorts of other contributions to Russia, both in Russia and also abroad, in Africa. And he said that a preliminary investigation had been launched. It would be carried out in full. Meanwhile, it's worth noting that the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has dismissed as a complete lie any suggestion that the Kremlin ordered Mr. Prigozhin's death.
Well, immediately after that crash, many people suspected that the Kremlin may be behind it, even without sort of any proof. So what's making international authorities even more convinced now that Putin was likely behind this killing?
Well, you're right. There's been an almost near universal assumption that this was ordered by the Kremlin. CIA Director William Burns said that he would have been very surprised if retribution had not been meted out on Mr. Prigozhin. He also said that Vladimir Putin prefers revenge as a dish served cold. It's worth remembering that the crash took place exactly 2 months after that failed mutiny you referred to in the introduction. So far, we do not have any hard evidence for what brought the plane down. The U.S. officials do seem to be leaning towards the theory that this was some kind of explosion on board. The Pentagon has said that there's no evidence so far to suggest that the plane was brought down by some kind of surface-to-air missile, one of the early suggestions. But certainly, I think most people are assuming, A, that Mr. Prigozhin was on board, for which we do not yet have 100% proof, and B, that this was indeed ordered and executed by the Kremlin.
And you know, you point out that an interesting component of Putin's statement was his praise for the Wagner Group fighters. What do we know about the possible future of these fighters now?
Very interesting. A number of places to look. One, to the north of here in Belarus, where some of those fighters relocated after that brief mutiny. Well, certainly for some weeks now, there's been evidence that those fighters have been leaving Belarus, even before the crash a couple of days ago. So that's one area. Here in Ukraine, there's been no evidence so far since the mutiny of Wagner troops continuing to play a significant role or even being present. Of course, you'll remember that they played a major role in the capture of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Well, there's no sign that Wagner fighters are in the country. Mr. Putin did refer to Africa. Now, that is one area where perhaps Wagner can continue, or at least its personnel can continue to play a vital role, because for several years in a number of countries, including Libya, Sudan, Mali, the Central African Republic, Wagner fighters have been very much involved, both offering security assistance to a number of African governments, political advice, political disinformation campaigns, and also crucially, and this is what matters perhaps most to the Kremlin, very much involved in a number of commercial activities, in particular the extraction of gold and precious metals and diamonds. That has been a source of revenue for the Kremlin as it tries to shore up its economy in the face of Western sanctions. It is very unlikely that the Kremlin is going to want to give any of that up. I think the question is, does it allow Wagner to continue to operate these various operations? Does it try to replace Wagner with some other private military company, or does it simply take over all of these operations wholesale and run them as the official Russian government? That remains to be seen, but Africa has certainly been a key component of what Wagner means to the Kremlin.
And certainly Putin has been working sort of overtime to reinforce that connection between Russia and Africa. Paul Adams, thank you. Well, the Pentagon says some Ukrainian fighter pilots will come to the U.S. next month for F-16 fighter jet training. The pilots first receive English language training in Texas and then travel to Moore's Air National Guard base in Arizona for fighter jet training. And this comes after the Biden administration announced the U.S. would expedite the transfer of F-16s to Ukraine from NATO members. Denmark and the Netherlands are running a similar training program in Europe.